Hello, my name is Alam Aline, and this is my presentation on the long-lasting effects of natural disasters. First, we must ask ourselves what a natural disaster is and examples of some. A natural disaster is a natural event such as a flood, earthquake, or hurricane that causes great damage or loss of life. Natural disasters in some ways are some of the most devastating surprises Mother Nature can produce. A disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or of society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses. Natural disasters do not discriminate from social class, age, or race. In many cases, natural disasters strike, and we as a species like to seem as if we are prepared. In many ways, we usually are not, and we suffer from the path of devastation, and the devastation usually is far worse than experts can predict or people prepare for. After a disaster strikes, many nations are called to aid and help rebuild the rubble into new. When nations respond, we are told that they put forth the effort for all victims' needs. In most cases, the aid received is usually discriminatory and never equal across the board. Here are two graphs that describe the immediate impact of natural disasters that we will discuss further in this presentation. As you can see by the two graphs, economically, places are destroyed immediately. However, it does not just affect areas economically, it affects communities and the land, such as natural resources. The road recovery is key in making sure that these are able to be rebuilt and that communities and everybody will be able to resettle into their area. The objective of the PowerPoint will be to discuss how lasting effects are greatly affected by the first stages of cleanup during natural disasters. We will meet the objective by discussing the issues of primary infrastructure, environmental sources, housing, and the ultimate goal of resettlement. First, primary infrastructure and rapid rehabilitation. The importance of infrastructure is that it will shape the entire road to rehabilitation to include timing of completion, migration, and economy for future to come. Infrastructure is the backbone to all development of cities and the beginning of long-lasting stability. Infrastructure can usually be met by having a clear vision of social and economic goals for a community. An accurate damage assessment must be completed in order to provide the necessary information for infrastructure to work. The assessment will determine the risk to reduce rehabilitation and to better the community. Nearly all reconstruction programs implemented globally by main institutions, disaster relief organizations, have produced inadequate results. Examples of infrastructure include roads, bridges, water supply, water sanitation, power generators, and facilities such as health, education, and agricultural development. Critics rightfully note that the sequence of recovery process can usually be uneven, the phases can overlap, and most importantly, that different social groups, even within the same community, can experience the sequence quite differently. Such differences can be seen in the initial length of the emergency period during the initial cleanup, which serves as an overall measure to both the magnitude of damage and the response capacity for different communities. These differences can also be evaluated separately from different groups within a community. For example, the earthquake of 1906 in San Francisco had a population of 400,000. They experienced catastrophic losses of 550 dead, 220,000 left homeless, 55% of housing units destroyed, and 300,000 evacuees. The 1906 emergency period lasted approximately 40 weeks and the restoration about 40 weeks. Functional reconstruction about 9 years. However, even in this early study, some major differences were observed in the recovery between social, economic, and ethnic groups. For example, a sample of residents selected from the city directories showed that 1 year after the earthquake, 74% of unskilled workers had not returned to the area versus 40% of white-collar workers. Using this sequence and timing, how does this reconstruction compare to New Orleans? Because of the magnitude of damage and the failures to respond, the Katrina emergency period extended over 6 weeks. The endpoint was determined by the dewatering of New Orleans, defined as a point when the floodwaters were pumped and drained by the city. However, because of the extraordinary damage and dispersal of the population, some experts would argue that the emergency period length can be seen as long as 14 weeks, when the end of the emergency shelter happened on December 3rd, 2005. Restoration is repairing of the infrastructure and urban life. Because of the lack of migration, no matter how early Katrina relief planned, they were unable to succeed. The result is that much repairable but population-dependent infrastructure has not been restored or used. Most services for which were electricity, gas, public transportation, schools, hospitals, and food stores. Most of them function for less than half of pre-Katrina capacity. The emergency period had a longer duration than that of the early studies and could readily explain by the evident failures of the initial evacuation and response to the cleanup. Using the 6-week emergency period, the expected restoration period was approximately 60 weeks. However, that lasted even longer because of the lack of migration back into New Orleans. The low-level income class did not want to return and felt as if they were not helped. Effects of natural disasters on resources. Environmental resources are a second concern of rebuilding and the recovery of natural disasters. The continuous degradation of highly sensitive ecosystems leads to the increased occurrence and magnitude of landslides and floods, with major physical and economic, social consequences. Thus, recovery should be used as an opportunity to enhance the management of water and environmental resources in order to reduce one of the major causes of future disasters. Several environmental restoration activities include cleaning of watersheds and restoration and reforestation programs. The Japanese earthquake and tsunami combo was affected physically by the tsunami very much so. The tsunami not only uprooted plants and washed trees from other areas onto shore, the salt water and sand washed out fields, so some animals were unable to graze. It also washed out rice paddies, and rice is still unable to grow in some of those areas. Natural resources in Japan are making a quick recovery because during their emergency response period, they knew that the land was greatly affected. They immediately started in rehabilitating ecosystems, and they were able to replant and pump out salt water. However, it still affects them. Key in closing the gap between the road of emergency relief and sustainable recovery. When one is able to restore housing, it helps the victims feel a sense of safety and normal activity. Rebuilding houses allows for the first key steps in reactivating and producing an economy that will allow people to return. When beginning the sustainable recovery building process, housing may include problems such as property issues, financing, capacity of buildings, technology available, designs involved, materials available, codes, restrictions, and finally safety standards of labor workers involved. Examples of horrible housing recoveries at Hiroshima earthquake of 2010 was a 7.0 magnitude earthquake that struck near Port-au-Prince. Over 200,000 homes were badly damaged and 105,000 were destroyed by the earthquake. 1.5 million people became homeless. There was 19 million cubic meters of rubble by Port-au-Prince. At its peak, 1.5 million people were living in camps, including 100,000 at critical risk from storms and floodings. When all the aid given to the Haitian effort, which amounted to about 70 million, it only improved water supply for 340,000 people, supplied medicine and medical treatment for about 50,000 people, gave tools and seeds to about 23,000 farmers, and improved shelter for about 34,000 people. As of 2015, 5 years after the earthquake, over 500,000 victims are still living in temporary shelters, and numerous others, 10 villages upon hillsides, that are still in critical risk from storms and flooding. Haiti, after the initial response period, was basically left alone and still struggles to reconstruct homes, and as a result, many Haitians are still left homeless. Resettlement of families during the aftermath of a disaster is a major concern among experts and government officials. The lasting effect of resettlement can be good, a positive, or a negative. In most cases, it's put on the back burner, and experience shows, however, that resettlement has complex issues and presents major challenges, both physically and psychologically. Some people have been too broke to return, and others have been too broken to return. Therefore, when constructing a resettlement program, it should go beyond the provisions of just housing and shelter, and should address needs for a population such as social infrastructure, social issues. It should help with livelihoods and economic activities. During early response periods, resettlement should always be accounted for because it requires more in-depth analysis, and it utilizes new buildings, and we need to minimize the risk of avoiding people not wanting to return, since people have strong economic, social, and cultural reasons for their influence, and that's why they choose to settle there. It is important for the location. Decisions of resettlement site are made in a consultative manner with full participation of the affected communities. Communities need to be prepared for and informed for what may or may not happen, and it must agree to the resettlement. Appropriate mechanisms should be put into place to ensure that land and housing tenure are agreed upon both by aid and the communities. In conclusion, disasters are always difficult to recover from and will continue to happen. Mankind must be ever so vigilant and careful to make sure that natural disasters are taken care of equally across the board and sustainable living is accomplished. We will only do so by, as a species, being better prepared and being ready to help those in need. This concludes my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the discussion board, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my abilities.